Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Capacity Reacts podcast. We're here to discuss the impact of the subsea cable cuts in the Red Sea and West Africa cables, and I'm delighted to be joined by an esteemed panel of guests from across the industry. Today we have Chris Wood, CEO of Wyatt Group, Ben Roberts, CTO of Liquid Technology, and Reese Morgan, who's the VP and General Manager for EMEA Media and Network Sales at Intelsat. We're going to start with Chris today. Chris, we know Wyatt are one of the firms leading the response to undersea cable cuts. What are your field teams doing to mitigate the challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Seth. Well, over the last 5 or 6 days since the cuts in West Africa seriously impacted the internet, we've had field teams working in data centers, both in Africa and also in Europe, to patch through and restore the bulk of the capacity onto other systems. So we've restored up to 2.5 terabits now of capacity, both north and south out of Lagos, on the Equiano system. We've had engineers working pretty much 20 hours a day for 5 days. And over that period, they've restored, I think, over 30 client networks, ISPs and major telcos in Nigeria. We've nailed up over 100 circuits, both north and south out of Lagos, and also tripled the capacity in our IP backbone. And that's required us to source optics and cards from our suppliers at short notice. We didn't have enough spares to cater for all of this, so we've had to fly people to Lisbon, fly people from South Africa carrying cards to Lagos, ship cards from Copenhagen from some of our suppliers, and even ship cards from the US to make sure that we minimize the impact on the internet.
Ben, jumping straight over to you, I saw a tweet from you on March 14th that listed all of the cables affected by the cuts, and it was a pretty extensive list. What has Liquid been doing in the last couple of days, or the last couple of weeks actually, to combat the problems faced?
Yeah, thanks. I sent that tweet I think it was breaking news at the time, and I don't think anything has changed. And at the point when I sent it, we didn't even know what had really happened to those 4 cables. So we've known for some weeks about there are 3 cables cut in the Red Sea. And that has some impact. But, as Chris is saying, very similar thing. We're using most of our capacity in our IP network. So we have automatic failover. So for our own network, we didn't have to do so much running around, as Chris has described. But we did have some customers we had to move over. And we also brought some of that East Coast capacity online. We know that some of these repairs take a long time. So even when we have backup and redundancy, something fails, we know we need to restore that in case something else fails. So we were in pretty good stead when 4 cables went down at the same time in East Africa and West Africa. And really, at that time, there were some other failures of some pretty important cloud-based services, and people in Kenya were wondering what was going on. And so I think communicating with our customers is very important, but we've been doing similar activities as Chris is describing, but more bringing people onto the IP network, which has already got some kind of backup. We have seen this before. So when we've had multiple cable cuts, it's not the first time it's ever happened. And around about 2014, there were some pretty big events in East Africa. It meant we redesigned the way we run our networks completely. And we applied that same design in our West African networks, so we're not so badly affected. And ultimately, it's about not just connecting Africa to Europe, but connecting Africa back to the other peering points in Africa. And I think, what made some of the West African networks suffer so badly is that they are only really running circuits from whatever country they're in up to Europe. And when multiple cables were cut at the same time on that path, that is what's caused them to be in a chaotic position and needing so much help from Chris.
Yeah, and if I can just add then, Ben, sorry to jump in, Seth, but just to be clear, we weren't restoring our own network. Our own network is as protected as Liquid, in fact, probably more so. What we were doing there was rebuilding the internet for other providers. Some of the major operators in Nigeria and Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, didn't have the level of diversity that we had. So that's what we've been doing is restoring their networks for them, rather than our own clients. Our clients were fully protected, and we didn't lose any customer traffic at all because of the way we architect our own network. So what we've been doing is bringing everybody else back online that wasn't directly connected to the wired network or in one of our data centers.
Thanks for that, Chris. And just moving over to our third panelist today, Reese. We spoke to you 2 weeks ago about how satellites were being used to redirect traffic. You spoke to our lovely colleague, Jack. And have there been developments since we last spoke to you?
Yeah, so I think when I spoke to Jack, we were really focused on the Red Sea fiber cuts. And, I want to emphasize satellite is always going to be complementary to fiber. I think Chris mentioned several terabytes of traffic being restored. Now, we're not going to do that on a satellite system with all the best will and best technology in the world. But we are complementary. And, Ben talked about network design, and we would always encourage customers to think of a hybrid approach. So during the Red Sea cuts, we put together a couple of trunking services for customers who were experiencing some issues. But now with the cuts on the west coast of Africa predominantly, we've seen a tremendous uptick in discussions. In fact, much as per Chris's answer, we've had people on planes, we've had equipment on planes, and we're putting up links in a number of places across West Africa now. For the moment, those links are international, so either from our facilities in Europe or the US into West Africa to provide some international connectivity. But we've spent time developing domestic networks as well across a number of countries, and what we're doing as well is looking at how we can expand on those so that there's a bit more diversity, as well as working with customers to try and kind of future-proof a little bit. So we are seeing, different discussions and different demand there. And I think also we've seen some enterprises pick up the phone as well to ask what they can do to provide some sort of ultimate backup in the case of failure.
Maybe I could just add one thing as well, because at Liquid, we're a big satellite network operator. And that's to say that we operate the ground segment of satellites. Intelsat are one of our big partners in doing that. And we have, as I said, changed over the years, changed the way networks have been designed. So 15 years ago, it used to be a case that, an Earth station somewhere in Europe, in Germany or UK would have a big trunk link back to Africa. And that would be used for that first mile link that the cables are now providing. But in the way we do our satellite networks, for about 10 years, almost more, we've been having our Earth stations in Africa. So it's kind of used more for those domestic networks that Reese is talking about, and enterprise connectivity and broadband connectivity. So our main sort of, the main hubs are actually on the African continent. So if we had an outage on a network, then our satellite networks would have been down as well, because they would have been taking IP feeds, from an African Earth station. But, it's really a big piece of how networks are designed to sort of have that complement of satellite and fiber.
Reese, back to you on the national operators' lack of redundancy. I wanted to know, do you think that this is something that, in terms of their strategy, will that change moving forward, and will they start to invest in more alternative channels and routes?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's fair to say there's a lack of redundancy, but maybe now what they're going to look at is enhanced redundancy. As data consumption goes ever upwards, then you need to look at new ways of delivering services. So, for example, if I just take the satellite route, then, we're looking at combining LEO and GEO orbits to bring the best of kind of both worlds and all technology into customers, and then couple that with terrestrial, whether that's wireless or fiber. And I think these kinds of incidents, and Ben touched on something that happened sort of middle of the last decade, these kind of incidents challenge designers, CTOs, organizations to think slightly differently. And so, if I look at a telco model, for example, mobile money and a lot of the applications that are supported in the cloud, any sort of outage, be it for a few minutes or a few hours, can prove to be very costly. And so just having this redundancy, and, as Ben said, Liquid are great partners of ours and have got an incredibly well thought out hybrid network. But having that redundancy is all important, right? Because not only is it bad for the consumer experience, but it very quickly becomes quite punitive financially. So these types of incidents often cause people to think slightly differently. And as I said, we've had large mobile network operators and others on the phone to us over the last couple of weeks, and we've deployed people and equipment to various places. But we've also had a number of large enterprises on the phone as well, to ask about backup options should their affiliates, let's say, be cut off from their HQ.
And yeah, as Ben mentioned, there was kind of this same sort of issue back in 2014 or around that time. I wanted to kind of ask about the mainstream media attention. Has that changed since then? Are people starting to realize that subsea cables are increasingly important to national and international infrastructure? And has this been changing people's minds about redundancy and network resilience? Perhaps, Chris, we can come to you first for this one.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot more coverage of these outages and these cable cuts, particularly because of the geopolitical situation in the Red Sea. I think it's a hot topic at the moment. And as Ben said, the cuts in the Red Sea are very complex and are going to be extremely challenging to repair, given the physical threat to life in the Red Sea, in that part of just off the coast of Yemen. So I do think there's a lot more attention from the mainstream media. Clearly, the West Coast cuts have made the impact felt very strongly in certain countries. Ghana, for example, doesn't have the benefit of the Equiano cable. So Ghana is still largely offline today, whereas Nigeria has been mainly restored. So I do think it'll impact how people architect their networks. I think almost all of the major operators will now look at how many cables they have, whether they take them north and south, whether they're going just to Europe, or are they going to major nodes down in South Africa for protection, and how they build their IP networks. Equiano is relatively new. It went live at the early part of last year. But that doesn't mean that there's a lot of traffic on it, because people have to light their own fiber pairs. Each owner of Equiano, such as we have our own fiber pair and we put our own equipment on it and then light it as we need it. But some of the fiber pairs that are being sold to operators haven't even been lit yet. So I think that's something that people will look at. As the new cables come online, do you light more capacity more quickly to increase that level of diversity and give you headroom in your network? There's another cable coming relatively soon in Africa. The 2 Africa cable on the West Coast will go live towards the end of this year. And that'll also increase the redundancy capability, but only if people buy capacity on those fiber pairs, only if they light the fiber pairs.
I mean, if I can just sort of expand a little bit on the geopolitical angle, I think really since the start of the Ukraine war, certainly across the North Sea and the Baltic, we've had a number of discussions with people and indeed have implemented services. And whether that's because people have got security concerns about, possibly nefarious actions in terms of intercepting traffic, and that's not necessarily related to subsea cables, but just a general sort of telecoms infrastructure concern, through to actual cable cutting, then we've had a lot of discussions there where people have wanted to airlock their networks from any other terrestrial elements, and satellite with its kind of point-to-point and point-to-multipoint abilities. It is pretty useful there in terms of keeping your traffic away from anything outside of your own premises, let's say. But I think there's been increasing coverage. I've seen multiple articles on the potential impacts of let's say piratical activity, if we characterise it as that, on international cables and the reliance. So I think there's definitely an uptick in interest, and I think whilst the sort of events of the last few weeks are kind of negative, I suppose it's an opportunity for people to think again about how they're operating and designing, and hopefully able to put in mitigating techniques so that these types of incidents are less and less impactful on people's networks.
And I think this, back to the question that was asked, this geopolitical element of it has made it more interesting to that mainstream media. But I have spoken to a couple of large global media outlets, and I told them before, I'm not going to talk about the reason for the cuts in the Red Sea, because that is clearly a political issue. But they were fine with that. I think they just really wanted to know, can you explain to people, about the subsea cables? But I'm going to give one example of how definitely networks are going to change and why. One cable clearly isn't enough. if you're in a country and you've got one cable route, that isn't enough. So there are some countries in Africa, West Coast, who've only got one cable entry point. 2 isn't enough either. 3 isn't enough either. It's never enough. So we've even seen, in this incident, Nigeria, which has got, really a good number of cables that are live, being very, very severely affected, mainly for the reason Chris has said, that the Equiano is quite new. So a lot of traffic hadn't moved onto Equiano. A lot of the existing players have not been part of Equiano, and new challengers such as Liquid and Wyok have taken fiber pairs into that market. But some of the countries near there have only got still 2 or 3 entry points. What will happen, it'll make, rather than, if you're a country that's got 2 fiber cables and they're going in the same sort of geographic path, you're not going to think, let me run my 2 cables. I'll get redundancy by running 2 cables up to Europe, going through the same geographical area. You'll start thinking, well, let me use one of these cables to go south. Actually, let me use one of these cables to go to a place that's near me, a hub like Lagos or Johannesburg or Nairobi. I'm going to use one of these cables to go to this hub where I can then hop onto 5 or 6 or 7 cables. Then you mitigate your risk by having a shorter run of that single cable, right? So this is what is going to happen. This is what happened really after 2014. Tanzania is a great example. We used to have circuits from Tanzania going all the way to the Europe. But Kenya right next door has got 6 subsea cables now. We now run all of our circuits from Tanzania. We run subsea to Nairobi, and then pick up the benefit of 6 or 7 cables for that redundancy. So this is the re-engineering that's going to happen, and it's been happening in everybody gets their hands to the pump way that Chris described, but then countries and networks are going to have a serious rethink, and they're going to say, actually, how do I permanently redesign the way we're doing our backbone networks?
Yeah, I think countries also need to look at taking every opportunity of a new fiber system that's coming past their door. They need to take every opportunity to make it as easy as possible to land that cable in their country, because it's not for the benefit of the operators, it's for the benefit of the economy. And there are all sorts of statistics about the penetration of broadband and the price of broadband and the reliability of broadband, about what it does to GDP in a country. We've got an opportunity in the near future to bring Equiano into Ghana, and that'll make a big difference. Equiano is actually architected quite differently from the other systems that were cut. And the reason that it wasn't cut is that it goes straight out to sea, several hundred kilometers offshore, and doesn't hug the coastline. Whereas the 3 or 4 cuts that happened off Cote d'Ivoire last week are all relatively close to shore, because they go in and out of every country. And the closer you are to shore, the more risk it is to get it cut. And the likelihood that these cables were cut by an undersea landslip is pretty high. There's a undersea canyon that runs offshore going out to sea from Cote d'Ivoire in this area. And you can see from the times of when the cables were cut that this was most probably hit by an undersea, almost like an avalanche in snow. It just rolls down the canyon and takes out everything in its path. And the 4 cables that were cut were all in a line going offshore from Cote d'Ivoire. Whereas Equiano, the reason it wasn't cut is it's past the end of this canyon when it goes north to south. And that's a big important thing to look at, where the cables are, and make sure you understand the actual topology and how close they are to each other when you're making investments in different systems for redundancy.
And even last year, 3 of the same 4 cables that are cut now were cut by an undersea rock speed off DRC.
Same thing.
So it's they're running on the same corridor the whole way down the coast effectively, and it's a bit like Nairobi to Mombasa. We have these 2 cities, and there's a road and there's a railway and there's a pipeline and there's fiber, and they're all within a couple of kilometers of each other going down the same transport corridor, and it's pretty much like that.
Yeah, and again, if you look at the Red Sea as well, all of the cables are in a very narrow corridor going up the Red Sea, because they had to be as deep as water as possible. The Red Sea in the areas where they got cut is very narrow. So there's a very narrow corridor where all of these cables were, 3 that were cut in the Red Sea. And the incident narrowly missed 4 other cables. So there is a high level of of risk in some of the areas of the world where cables pass very close together.
Chris, just going to jump in here. You mentioned Ghana a couple of times, and Ghana's facing obviously an internet meltdown. We've seen Ghana in response to this license Starlink, and that's going to go into service in Q3 of this year. Is this kind of a knee-jerk reaction to the cable cuts? Maybe we can go to Chris first and then Reese after.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a knee-jerk reaction. I think, as Reese said earlier, and he'll speak better than I will on this, but satellite plays a very important part of the overall mix of technologies used for data services, and voice and data services. So it's very important that the countries have both satellite services and also subsea fiber. But my point was on Ghana was we need to also bring Equiano to Ghana. That won't be available by the end of this year, but it's probably a 2-year project to bring it in. And I think we really need to make that point that it's important that all cables that go past the door of a country need to come in as much as possible, because you do require multiple systems, as Ben said, 3, 4, 5. It's never really enough, but the more you have, the less impact when 1 or 2 of them go down.
There's something I don't know about Starlink, and I'm going to put this question to Reese because he might know a bit more than me. I'm a student of Starlink, and I'm testing it in certain scenarios. But it's well known that currently the Starlink gateway that's being used by Starlink services in Africa is in Lagos. So they only have one gateway on the continent of Africa, and I know they plan to do more, but there's only one at the moment. But what I don't know is whether the inter-satellite links would be able to have an African Starlink user get all the way to a gateway in Europe or North America or some other gateway that's off the continent. So I'm actually, maybe Reese might know the answer to this because I'm quite curious to understand how many ISL links can actually work.
So, I mean, I'm not privy to their design, but what I would say is that any smart, sophisticated satellite network is going to be able to adapt and flex, right? So typically, if the infrastructure's there, then most satellite operators, including ourselves, are going to be able to use the terrestrial infrastructure to deliver what we need to, and whether that's switching on the satellite or, maybe in some cases providing 2 satellite hops, and that's not unique to our technology. I think probably every operator would do that. And one of the challenges with a sort of a global system that in many ways is perhaps almost one size fits all is it's difficult to develop something that's bespoke. Whereas the approach that ourselves we're taking now is we're very much designing something that is exactly what the customer, or indeed in one case the country, is looking for, rather than kind of delivering a global and uniform service. So I think, again, and I don't want to sound repetitive, but I think pretty much every technology has a part to play in just the general day-to-day network delivery. And, equally, every technology will have a part to play, possibly some more length on than others, in times of stress of one of the particular delivery routes. But certainly some of the countries in West Africa, for example, are very particular about where the traffic lands. They would always want it to land domestically. And that's where a network like ours, which is kind of designed for the purpose, kind of really comes into its own. So, it needs to be a mix. And I don't think there's one technology that's going to fix everything here.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well. And it's some countries like that, but certainly certain types of users are going to want landing and pickup in the same country. And really, that actually covers a lot of the type of users we have of existing satellite systems. Those people who want secure systems for banking, ATM machines, obviously military users and whatever. So that's a pretty common requirement for that to be, the satellite customers to want that, Reese, yeah?
Yeah, 100%. And I think, what we've seen, and I think both of you have highlighted this quite clearly, is as fiber is landing on the shores of particular countries, then satellite has been used to carry that connectivity inland, if I can characterize it like that. And in many cases, we see that inland infrastructure can be repurposed to provide an international hop should it be needed. But very much our role on the continent as fibre has been arriving is to provide domestic extension to the fibre connectivity, as opposed to perhaps our more historical role, which was international connectivity. But, we can link back into providing some complementary international connectivity where needed. But, such are the data demands. I mean, there's one pretty small country in West Africa that we've been talking to the regulator. They're looking for 40 gigs to be turned up almost immediately. That's not something that any satellite operator is going to be able to do. So, there are limits to what we can do, but in terms of providing complements and perhaps sort of ultimate backup, then that's a role we can play internationally, and then domestically we're very much involved in distributing that connectivity from the subsea systems.
Thanks so much to our panelists for joining us today. It was very interesting to get these different views and approaches on this very, very important and timely topic. And thanks for joining us on this episode of Capacity Reacts, and stay tuned to www.capacitymedia.com for more.